Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the global anti-terrorism. There couldn't be anything more important than being against terrorism. My large part of my life is devoted to addressing the fallacy of deterrence with nuclear weapons. But you break down the word, and deterrence is with terrorism, deterrence. It's a doctrine of mutual terror and the pursuit of security through terror. We couldn't find a more dramatic juxtaposition of values than the values put forward by Mahatma Gandhi and compared to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence resting on the threat to annihilate the entire future of humanity in order to preserve the alleged security of the state. There are 2 states in South Asia now squared off with these nuclear arms. 70% of the malnourished children in the world live in these 2 states. 30% of the children in Pakistan are malnourished, as are 30% of the children in India. They have no security. And the more the weapons are perfected, the less security is obtained. It's the ultimate paradox of modernity, as one of Martin Luther King's statements said it clearly. It's an improved means to an unimproved end. Now, there's no way to talk about the modern state of America without reference to Mahatma Gandhi. Today, in my country, millions of people are reminded that the cancer of racism has been a terrible divide from the beginning of the United States of America, when slavery was legitimate. We had a civil war over that issue. Today, to cure that cancer, we have a movement called Black Lives Matter. But there would be no Black Lives Matter movement without Martin Luther King. And there would be no civil rights and Martin Luther King's leadership without Mahatma Gandhi. And I might add that there really would be no doctrine of ahimsa without Mahavir. And Mahavir, the great Jain teacher, referenced the doctrine of ahimsa going back even before him. And it's a doctrine of life that is grounded in the highest human understanding to have no violence in intention, thought, or deed. And therefore, because today is a day of honoring the great sage, political leader, lawyer, and servant of the people, Mahatma Gandhi, I want to quote some things that he said and reflect on them before I get into the more existential issues of today. He said, and I'm going to just give some quotes for reflection, "There only is life where there is love. Life without love is death. Love is the reverse of the coin of which the obverse is truth. It is my firm faith that we can conquer the whole world by truth and love." Well, in that is the core of his philosophy. And in that is the core of a philosophy that says the metrics of success in life are not the acquisition of material wealth, fame, titles, or illusory power. The metric of a success in life is the secret in the heart of love. He said, "Let everyone try and find out that as a result of daily prayer, he adds something new to his life, something with which nothing else can be compared. I do dimly perceive that whilst everything around me is ever changing, ever dying, underlying all that changing is a living power that is changeless, that holds all together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates, that informing power or spirit is God. And since nothing else that I see merely through the senses can or will persist, he alone is. I have found that people envy my peace. That peace comes from prayer. I'm not a man of learning, but I humbly claim to be a man of prayer. I am indifferent as to the form. Everyone is a law unto himself in that respect. The force of nonviolence is infinitely more wonderful and subtle than the material force of nature, like electricity. The truth is that God is the force. He is the essence of life. He is pure and undefiled consciousness. He is eternal. Well, if God is consciousness, then he's available to every one of us, because every one of us is imbued with the gift of consciousness. Every one of us is imbued with the gift of life. And if God is life and God is consciousness, then the doorway of understanding Gandhiji's teaching is to understand ourselves. There's no such thing as defeat in nonviolence. I can truthfully say that I am slow to see the blemishes of fellow beings, being myself full of them. I am endeavoring to see God through service to humanity, for I know that God is neither in heaven nor down below, but in everyone. Now just think of the ethical admonition that he's put forward here. The idea that if God is in everyone, that would include the Chinese who are fighting at the border with India today. That would include people in Pakistan. That would include the people in the White House of the United States. That would include you and me. And the ethical admonition that he lived by, that Mahatma Gandhi lived by, was to treat everyone as a gift from God. God is conscience. He is even the atheism of the atheist. For in his boundless love, God permits the atheist to live. He is the searcher of hearts. Gandhi said, I know that I can do nothing. God can do everything. O God, make me thy fit instrument and use me as thou wilt. I can testify that I may live without air and water, but not without him. You may pluck out my eyes, but you cannot kill me. You may chop off my nose, but that will not kill me. But blast my belief in God, and I'm dead. There's not a moment when I do not feel the presence of a witness whose eye misses nothing and with whom I strive to keep in tune. I cannot recall a moment in my life when I had a sense of desertion by God. Nonviolence is not a garment to be put on and taken off at will. It sits in the heart, and it must be an inseparable part of our very being. As food is necessary for the body, prayer is necessary for the soul. Prayer is an impossibility without a living faith in the presence of God within. God demands nothing less than complete self-surrender as the price for the only real freedom that is worth having. I have an immovable faith in God and his goodness, and an unconsumable passion for truth and love. But is that not what every person has latent in them? Well, I share those quotes so we have some sense of what motivated Mahatma Gandhi. But he was very practical. He ironically used the wisdom of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, the doctrine of ahimsa, going back thousands and thousands of years, but he used the tools, some of the tools that of political science that had developed in the West, the tools of law, the tools of the use of the nation, but not the nation as a new idol, but as a tool to serve the people. You know, today there are extreme nationalists in my country, and I understand in India also, who view the nation as a kind of God. And I know there are nationalists in India who firmly reject Gandhi's wisdom. And they see being part of a nation as being separate from the entirety of humanity and separate from the entirety of life itself. And of course, if you're separated from God's family, you're going to be separated from God. The idolatry of the state has led to the production of weapons which we really are incapable of imagining the destructive capacity of. Gandhi was very emphatic about the absurdity and the immorality of nuclear weapons and pondered the effect of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the soul of the country that had dropped them. A very profound understanding of the use of force. The bombs we have in today's arsenal dwarf the destructive capacity of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were a mere 15 kilotons or 15,000 tons of TNT. We have bombs in them in the megaton range. There's 70 times the size. A 1 megaton bomb is 70 times the size of what was dropped on Hiroshima. We now know from science that if a mere 100, less than 1% of the over 13,000 in the world today were to go off, it would throw approximately 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere and end the agricultural base of modern civilization. We used to have a doctrine called mutually assured destruction. We now know that if one country were to use all of their weapons, say if India or Pakistan were to use all of their weapons, they would destroy themselves as well. So we now have self-assured destruction. Gandhi saw the human family as one. This was one of his main points. And nuclear weapons make it very clear that the human family is one. Let's just look at the geopolitical aspect of it today. India did not get its nuclear weapons because of Pakistan, it got them because of China, and China didn't get them because of India. So even if China and India solve all of their problems, China is still going to want to have their nuclear bombs because of Russia. And Russia didn't get them because of China. Russia got them because of the United States. The Soviet Union got them because of the United States, and the United States got them because of Adolf Hitler. And thus the only way of dealing with it is with a universal ban. But we will not have a universal ban unless we redefine security, unless we define security in terms of serving human needs and serving those values that Mahatma Gandhi represented, serving those values of love and truth, the truth being the human family is one, the planet Earth is one, every child comes into the world with a heart without borders, and the duty of the state is to protect its citizens, and the citizens of states cannot be protected as long as nuclear weapons hang over their heads. And if anything makes this point today as clear as possible, it is the coronavirus. The world spent over $1.6 trillion last year in building military means to pursue security. And this very simple virus, carrying no passport, making no distinction between rich, poor, Muslim, Christian, Jew, atheist, anybody, this one little virus really threatens our security. We wiped out polio and smallpox because all of the countries in the world cooperated in that endeavor. But today, we don't see that cooperation. Today, because of the idolatry of nationalism and the idolatry of religion, and the idolatry of race, and the idolatry of arrogance, we're separated. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have states. Certainly Mahatma Gandhi wanted the state of India. I am only saying that the purpose of the state is to take care of its people. And the state in today's world cannot take care of its people without using the wisdom of nonviolence, love, and cooperation that Mahatma Gandhi so clearly lived. We cannot protect the climate at the level of the nation. It requires a global cooperation. We cannot address the pandemic, this pandemic, or the next pandemic without global cooperation, and we cannot get rid of nuclear weapons without it. So it requires a change of thought. It requires a different approach to how we define security. Now, the United Nations was founded on these principles. We know how to do it, but we need the secret sauce that Mahatma Gandhi brought to the table. He understood when he talked about nuclear bombs that our choice was nonviolence or non-existence. The dynamics of violence and its friends of fear, denial, and falsehood, and the dynamics of nonviolence and its friends of love, truth, and peace both begin in our hearts. The most offensive expression of that violence grows from the heart bereft of peace. And its manifestation is not always hatred. Sometimes it's apathy. Sometimes it's indifference. Sometimes it's not feeling the suffering of the outcast, the disenfranchised. And that's why Mahatma Gandhi said to evaluate a policy of the state, envision the person who is the most deprived of power, the most disenfranchised, the poorest person, and contemplate, is that policy going to be a benefit or burden to that person? That is the clarity that he brought to social analysis. Now, does anybody think that India wants to conquer Pakistan and absorb over 100 million very poor people? Or does anyone think that Pakistan wants to conquer India? Now, let's look at the 500 years of violence in Europe. Just contemplate this for a second. 100 years ago, one could hardly have conceived of France and Germany living in peace. Today, we can hardly conceive of them not living in peace. World War II. During World War II, it was inconceivable that Japan and the United States could be at peace. So these are very different cultures with very different languages and very different heritages and backgrounds. But very quickly, their common humanity and common shared interests overcame decades of violent confrontation, fear, and hatred. There isn't even that much of a difference culturally between Pakistan and India. They used to be part of one whole. So I have a lot of hopes that, especially the young people watching this, will develop the kind of wisdom to take us into the more reasonable and spiritually grounded future that we need. Because before us now is the choice of peace or pieces. Now, one of the most exemplary disciples of Mahatma Gandhi was Dr. Martin Luther King. And I say disciple because I'm a disciple of a great Sufi, Baba Muhammad, who taught and lived the principles of ahimsa, who loved all lives. I literally saw a deer that had followed him out of the forest that would cry when he sang. And I saw how he treated prime ministers and beggars as his own family without distinction of caste, race, religion, high or low. So I met a human being and lived with one who exemplified exactly these values. So I know that it's real. I know that it can be done. And I've met several others. So let me quote Martin Luther King when his Nobel Peace Prize lecture. Our problem today is that we've allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We've allowed the means whereby we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of our modern life can be summarized in improved means to an unimproved end. This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. Henry David Thoreau was the person who understood this key dilemma of modernity. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there's not proportionate growth of the soul. When the without of man's nature subjugates the within, dark storm clouds begin to form in the world. Like Gandhi, King viewed the most important parts of the human endeavor to be the character, the qualities, the heart of the human. King said, violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. Do I still, Gandhi, and King quoted Gandhi, Gandhi said, do I still adhere to my faith in truth and nonviolence? Has not the atomic bomb exploded that faith? Gandhi said, not only has it not done so, but it has clearly demonstrated to me that the twins, nonviolence and truth, constitute the mightiest force in the world. Before it, the atom bomb is of no effect. The two opposing forces are wholly different in kind, the one moral and spiritual, the other physical and material. The one is infinitely superior to the other, which by its very nature has an end. The force of the spirit is ever progressive and endless. Its full expression makes it unconquerable in the world. In saying this, I know I've said nothing new. I merely bear witness to the fact. What is more, that force resides in everybody, man, woman, and child, irrespective of the color of the skin. Only in many it lies dormant, but it is capable of being awakened by judicious training. It is further to be observed that without the recognition of this truth and due effort to realize that there's no escape from self-destruction, the remedy lies in every individual training himself for self-expression in every walk of life, irrespective of response by the neighbor. So Mahatma Gandhi puts the responsibility of the judicious discipline training in purity of the heart and intention, thought, and deed on each of us. King said, recent events have vividly reminded us that nations are not reducing, but rather increasing their arsenals of weapons of mass destruction. The best brains in the highly developed nations of the world are devoted to military technology. The proliferation of nuclear weapons has not been halted. The fact that most of the time human beings put the truth about the nature and risks of nuclear war out of their minds because it's too painful and therefore not acceptable does not alter the nature and risks of such war. The device of rejection may temporarily cover up anxiety, but it does not bestow peace of mind and emotional security. There may have been a time when war served as a negative good by preventing the spread and growth of an evil force, but the destructive power of modern weapons eliminated even the possibility that war may serve as a negative good. If we assume that life is worth living, that man has a right to survive, then we must find an alternative. In a day when vehicles hurtle through outer space and guided ballistic missiles carve highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can claim victory in war. A so-called limited war will leave little more than a calamitous legacy of human suffering, political turmoil, and spiritual disillusionment. A world war, God forbid, will leave only smoldering ashes as a mute testimony of a human race whose folly led inexorably to ultimate death. But he doesn't leave on a down note. He really makes the point of how serious their dilemma is. So if modern man continues to flirt unhesitatingly with war, he will transform his earthly habitat into an inferno such that even the mind of Dante could not imagine. I do not wish to minimize the complexity of the problems that need to be faced in achieving disarmament and peace. But I think it is a fact that we shall not have the will, the courage, and the insight to deal with such matters unless in this field we are prepared to undergo a mental and spiritual reevaluation, a change of focus which will enable us to see that the things which seem most real and powerful are indeed now unreal and have come under the sentence of death. We need to make a supreme effort to generate the readiness, indeed the eagerness to enter the new world, which is possible. It's not enough to say we must not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We've inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner, Westerner, Gentile, Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live without each other, must live somehow in this one big world together, to live with each other. This means that more and more our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must now give an overriding loyalty to humankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing love for all men. When I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response, which is little more than emotional bosh. I'm speaking of that force, the soul force that drove Gandhi. I'm speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of all life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door to ultimate reality. I believe that even amidst today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there's the hope of a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day, education, culture for their minds, dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered men have torn down, men other-centered can build up. I think the fact that you and I are gathering today to remember and vivify and commit in our lives to live up to these principles that Gandhi put before us that showed how practical they are. There wouldn't be a country of India without him, and there wouldn't be the hope for a new day in America without those teachings. And I believe that that power of love is in every one of us. And I know that if we rely on it, our lives will be rich, fulfilled, and filled with peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan, for a great talk. We were actually thinking that, we should get a lot of, we're expecting more from you. And we're truly overwhelmed by your kind words. Now, I would request the audience, the researchers, the seniors to kindly uh, come with their questions. So maybe we can start with the question from General Singh, General KJ Singh, if you are there.
Yeah,
Sir, over to you.
yeah, Aditya, basically, it's very topical that we are discussing this issue
Sure.
when, despite everyone saying that he's committed to Gandhi's values, we are seeing multiple conflicts in Azerbaijan, in the Granoff-Karabakh region, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Two nations are at war. There are conflicts which are taking place in Syria and in Libya. There is this China which is knocking at India's LAC in Ladakh. There is disquiet in South China Sea. So Gandhi ji had given this template for us to follow, but it appears that we are not actually being sincere in just doing the lip service part of it. Everyone says Gandhi ji, yet you see horrific incidents take place in our social life also, where the lower castes are not given their due. So I think such discussions, such reflections, such introspections are very necessary. Even if they don't bring 100% compliance, at least they prick the conscience of people and make them think. And at least some of us will get back into that template which has been described by him. That's all I wanted to say. It's more of a statement, less of a question.
Correct, General Singh, and it means a lot. I mean, anything you want to say, Jonathan?
Absolutely. General, thank you so much, because I do think that the highlighting the difference between is and ought is something we should always be aware of. I had a wonderful meeting with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Max Kampelman. Max Kampelman was one of the advisors to Ronald Reagan, who was instrumental in helping to end the Cold War. And in that discussion, Max talked about the power of ought. And he highlighted my country was begun with the power of ought, where Thomas Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." And when he said that, that was very far from the is. At that time, indigenous people certainly were not included. No women were included, and men without property were not included. But today we've come to understand that this principle of the equality of all lives is the point. And it's become a galvanizing principle of the legitimacy of every government. Even the worst of dictators pays the price of hypocrisy for it. So the ought of the golden rule, the ought of the principle of ahimsa, these are galvanizing principles that help in the evolution of civilization. Our choice before us, because of the power of the state and the power of modern technology, couldn't be clearer. These principles of spiritual awakening that come to us from the wise from time immemorial, to see the human family as one and to seek justice and peace through justice, they have to be the compass. You mentioned Azerbaijan and Armenia. And what's interesting is in the daily papers, people have no idea of what we're faced with, because one of the problems we have is, I call it the pornography of the trivial. And the internet generation is inundated with it. But let's look at this one. Armenia has a security treaty with Russia, which, if the fighting continues and exacerbates, they could call upon Russia to come to their aid. And we know that Turkey is aligned now with Azerbaijan. If we had a situation, and we very well could, in which Russia and Turkey were squared off against each other, then we have a terrible situation, because Turkey is a party to NATO. And Article 5 of NATO means all of NATO has to come to Turkey's aid. And all of a sudden, you have, from this local conflict, a potential world war. That's how World War I started. So not only do we see the unity of the human family in terms of the good, but we see it also in terms of some of our ignorances and the great hazard that it has. So this has shown us, as does the virus, that insecurity and disruption anywhere can affect everyone everywhere. This conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia could spread to the world, just as the conflict between India and China, or any number of places which we will see in our lifetime. as climate change impacts more and more, there will be vast numbers of displaced people, vast social disruption. To me, it only highlights, General, how important these exalted principles that make us human are, to be a compass to go through these troubled times.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, we have a question from our viewers from Twitter. The question is from Lehman Wani from Kashmir. He says, what is the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy for the 21st century, if you could explain?
Well, I hope I've been answering that. It's the compass. It's the compass point for social policy. The relevance is to, when evaluating any policy, to put before you the face of the most displaced, disenfranchised, poorest person you can imagine, and think to yourself, does this policy burden or benefit them? $70 billion spent on weapons in South Asia is not going to bring the peace and security that if a mere portion of that was spent on taking care of people and building ties between nations and peoples, that would bring us. The clarity of wisdom is needed to overcome the distortions of fear and the idolatry of ethnic, religious, and national separatism.
Okay. Well, thank you. We have General Rakesh Sharma with us. I guess he has a point to make. General Sharma, over to you. General Sharma? Okay. Sir, we have a question from our viewers from YouTube. It says, how can we bring in the Gandhian ideology in the today's divisive and dirty politics scenario of India?
By committing to work with other people of like mind, to use the power of the vote, and to challenge the distortions of the core values upon which India is founded. There are deep wisdom traditions in India. You have the traditions of Buddha was there, Mahavir, Ashok, Mahatma Gandhi, and many wise saints and sages throughout the ages. I mean, India has that, and India also has the tradition of a caste system and a great tolerance for injustice. But this is the nature of the world. The nature of the world is not being perfect. The issue is, what is the arc of morality that you and I will live by? If you use the metrics, the short-term metrics of success, then certainly Socrates, who gave up his life to advance the rule of law, would appear a failure. Jesus would appear a failure. And one could argue that Gandhiji was a failure because of the violence that ensued in the partition. But I think from the eyes of wisdom, these examples of the most exalted human beings are worthy of emulation. Now, the first point is to develop skills and tools. Remember, Gandhi had the tool of being a sophisticated lawyer, so he had strategic capacity to bring the principles of nonviolence into effective political action. So I think the first thing, my young brother, is to develop your tools, your skills. I don't know what you're studying, but whatever you're studying, develop some degree of excellence. But then in your heart, dedicate those tools that you have, dedicate them to the service of the higher good. If you try that, things will conspire to fulfill that higher purpose. And that's the best way. Don't think that you can save the whole world, because that's way too abstract. Think about what you can do to contribute to fulfill the highest values within your own heart. If you forget that, if you forget those higher values, and you pursue any other pursuit, acquiring as much wealth as you possibly can, as much status as you possibly can, you will never achieve peace. But if you put those values first and follow them, peace will be the way to peace, and you'll have peace in the midst of conflict and activity. The world is not ever going to be heaven, but the journey of our own personal evolution, our own personal life, can be a life of peace and fulfillment. And that's good enough.
Thank you. Well, just to update you that we are right now live streaming it on YouTube, Insta, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. So everyone is actually asking many questions. So we have a question from LinkedIn from Mr. Pratyush. Well, he says exactly, how can we use the Gandhi's ideas and beliefs for an Atmanirbhar Bharat or a self-reliant India?
Well, it's interesting. Gandhi had a lot of, he had a lot of. It would be arrogant for me to really advise India on its domestic economic and social policies, but there are certain principles that we know that he adhered to, and much of it revolved around focusing on human security, focusing on building from the cultural roots of the country, but mainly having the metrics of what is success for a country. And obviously, he advocated getting rid of the caste system. He advocated making sure that village life was viable. He advocated a set of values that were based on tolerance and appreciation of diversity. He advocated lives focused on the personal evolution of character and spirituality. So if you take any issue of economic allocation of the state and you use those values, it changes the equation. As I pointed out, there's a terrible problem of malnutrition for the children of India. The Nobel Peace Laureate Dr. Kailash-ji focused mainly in saying, look, if governments take the position that will take care of the children, everything else will take care of itself. I don't know if that's 100%, but there's a lot of truth in that. Because if you look in the eyes of the children of Pakistan or India or China, all the children have the same light in their eyes. And if we start focusing on the well-being of children and make that a focus, we may bring the mothers into the table, and the mothers don't want their sons to go to war. So it's a refocusing on human security for the security of the state, and the focusing on those values that Gandhiji articulated for the development of character in the education and political system. How to operate that would, as I said, it would be very arrogant for me to get into the grit of the best way for India to go forward. I'm very, very comfortable with critical analysis of my own country, but certainly not to advise you. Only to say that some of the best in my country comes from the wisdom that comes from your country.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have a question from Instagram. This is from Ananya Vinod. Well, she says, how far do you think Gandhian ideals of peace and non-violence and taken into consideration while solving the international disputes with neighboring countries?
Well, I think they go all the way to heaven. I think they stretch from recognizing the hell of violence and the capacity of human depravity and destruction, all the way to take us to the promised land of living at peace with the natural world, peace with the other species which we're killing right now, peace with people different than ourselves, and most important, harmony of the soul with the Creator. So I think these principles go the entire way. The issue is what are the skillful means of applying them? I mean, the tools that we have of social organization, of of law have created institutions of law that operate without conscience. Corporations, for example, which are two major institutions of modernity that impact the natural world and are creating unsustainability for the future. One is the state, the other is the corporation. Now the corporation's raison d'etre is profit and perpetual growth. And our economic order is based on the concept of perpetual growth. But the natural world is not based on perpetual growth. It's based on harmony and cyclical patterns. The economy is based on perpetual growth, but the natural world doesn't operate that way. 500 years ago, there was no garbage. We now know that if everybody lived the middle-class lifestyle that I live here in America, the planet would not function. So we need to have an economic system. Our economic system has to have some degree of reality and be in harmony with the natural world. You know, in the accounting principles, for example, in business, the impact on the environment is not included. It's considered an externality. That's simply unrealistic. So our economic order is based on a myth of perpetual growth. And our nation states are based on the myth that states are capable of solving the problems that are impacting their populations alone. They can't. We can't protect the climate alone. We can't have a global economy without some kind of global legal system. So I think that reflecting on what's true becomes very important, and trying to apply what's true and real, particularly to these legal institutions that we've created, is really important. Because we create states, they don't come from God, and we create corporations. They don't come from God either. We create them, and they should be in harmony with the values that truth reveals to us.
Okay, thank you, sir. So may I proceed with the next question? We have a question from LinkedIn.
Please.
Yes,
just to add to what our dear elder Jonathan Granoff has talked about, this particular question about the Gandhian principles and the implication of Atmanirbhar, which is self-reliant. And absolutely, when we talk about self-reliant, doesn't mean that we give up on our global commitments of common values. Self-reliant is, of course, an important aspect of our own growth, of our progress, but that never implies that we give up on the universal value system, global understanding of oneness, and also in the pursuit of being self-reliant, taking a part of overemphasizing and depriving of those who are not part of our own nation or our society. I think that's what Gandhian principle has always, because Mahatma Gandhi's life and his message, as I said earlier in my remarks, is not only for its own nation or Indian, but it's a global value. And that's what self-reliant also reflects, that we are becoming Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, at the same time in conjunction, in cooperation with the global value system, as we see our growth as the world growth, and if we see our loss as the world loss. And that's what truly self-reliance implications are in the light of Gandhian principle.
Thank you, Sayyid Salman Chishti, for your deep insights on the ideas and beliefs of Gandhi's for Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I was. Is Jonathan back, sir?
I am, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, in the self-reliance, he was in the. He went to the very grit of village life. And he was not keen on driving people into massive cities, because he looked at what was the quality of life that brought peace to people, and it was living in harmony with the natural world and their neighbors, and having a rich weave of social fabric. And so self-reliance, in his doctrine of self-reliance, went even to weaving your own clothes. It was very much, how can people live in a way in which they have true security in their food, security in their shelter, and security in community. those principles we've forgotten. We're now being driven to bring security to corporations and security to nations, and not security to people. So it comes back to these core values. And Salman, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we can really talk about, global concern when people don't have a quality of life that gives them a sense of peace and security with their neighbors. Certainly not when you have a political parties emphasizing religious and ethnic differences. That's simply unacceptable. We're finding it dysfunctional in the United States, and obviously in India, you know better than we do the problems of racial, religious, caste prejudice. It's completely against the principles that Gandhiji stood for, as well as every wise man and woman that we know from human history. They all begin with human unity.
Correct, sir. Correct. So now we have a question from Ms. Nikita Chandu from LinkedIn. Well, what she says is, when we talk about the betterment of farmers, how can we include ideas of Gandhiji in the policy making process? Should I repeat?
Yeah, I know the question. Well, it's a question of sustainable agricultural systems that rely greater on the use of natural, and living in harmony with the natural world, rather than the agribusiness like Monsanto and these companies that like Vandana Shiva. I would suggest, in answer to that question, that Vandana Shiva, a great wise woman in India who's written extensively on this subject of agriculture, sustainable agriculture. Mm-hmm. In the United States, the agribusiness was the basis of slavery. That the crops that the great plantations had depleted the soil. They depleted the topsoil. It was cotton and tobacco. And that's why there was this drive to expand the slave states that led to our Civil War. It appears to me that in many ways the agribusiness now, which is, at least in the United States, is literally depleting our topsoil by putting amphetamine-like chemicals into the food chain, is, again, greed, not really fulfilling need. And part of the need we have is sustainable agricultural practices. But I'm not expert enough in the technologies that are emerging in that field, but we know that that's the future. We know that we cannot deplete the topsoil. We know that we have to use water more efficiently than we have been, and the massive agribusiness is not focused on that. It's focused on short-term profits.
So, all right, sir. Now, there is a question again on Facebook, and this question is basically from Mr. G.K. Singh. He says, as in, the problem in our society related to the caste issues is that it's increasing day by day. How can we bring out the Gandhi's principles in order to maintain the law and order in the society?
Well, let's begin with our educational system. Our children, there are a lot of conflict prevention, conflict resolution skills that children can be taught. So we need to have that as infused early on, that the qualities of tolerance and appreciation of diversity as good values, as values that we cherish, that a multiplicity of points of view enhances our capacity to pursue truth, has to be part and parcel of the educational system. I know that the question that he posed is a question that's right before my country right now, with an election in which we have our president who's been exacerbating these problems, who's been empowering prejudice, racism, and fear. And we'll see whether this experiment in democracy in my country can prevail. I believe that it will. Certainly the majority of people, but one of the problems we have, although the vast majority agree with you and I that we need to overcome these differences of race and caste. In the last election in the United States, 100 million people in our country, that's a lot, not so much in your country, but this is a lot of voters. 100 million people didn't vote at all. They sat out. They didn't express their moral agency. It was apathy. They didn't believe they could make a difference. One of the things that Gandhi points out to us is that every one of us matters. Every one of us can make a difference. Now, what scale that is, that really depends on what God has planned for each of us. But we can, in our everyday lives, intend to make a difference. And if we intend that, opportunities to build bridges amongst castes and creeds and religions will present themselves. So the first thing is make it that intention within oneself and share it. Whatever scale is possible. But clearly, the very question that you pose is the question before the world right now. And personally, I mean, obviously, I'm involved in these affairs, but for years when I was practicing law, I wasn't as involved as I am now as much more of an activist. But in daily life, in whatever profession that you're in, there's always opportunities to express these values, and we have to seize them.
Thank you. Sir, we have a question posted on our website, and the question is from Miss Vimala Reddy from Telangana, down in south of India. The question says, like, what are your views on capital punishment for some crimes like terror activities, harassment, abuse, murder?
Well, I don't think that it's correct to kill people. And it's certainly illogical to kill people because they've killed people. I'm very much against capital punishment. I do believe in God, and people will be punished ultimately for what they do. Their karmic legacy will haunt them for the ills that they do. So I don't think that capital punishment is a legitimate course. And I think that we need to really become clear, what is our criminal justice system about? Is it about warehousing people, punishing them, rehabilitating them? The punishment model, you end up with recidivism. People leave prison worse than when they came in my country. That's what we've seen. In countries that have a rehabilitation model, that don't condemn the person but see them as a problem to be solved, they have far less crime. Now, as to terrorism, it's interesting. I've always thought that the war on terrorism is a misnomer. It would be as if in World War II we had a war on the Blitzkrieg. Terrorism is a tactic. And I don't think there's any terrorist act that's not also a criminal offense. So if there's a conspiracy based on a political ideology to commit murder, they should be prosecuted as conspiring to commit murder, as murderers, without giving any legitimacy or any quarter to their political logic or illogic for doing it. It's enough to prosecute them as being mere murderers with a distorted set of ideas. To have a war against terrorism will never wipe out a tactic, but we can have laws that prohibit the conduct. We don't need to go to the ideology behind it. It's the conduct that we have to prohibit. So no, I'm against capital punishment, and I think that we misunderstand by focusing on terrorism and not the crimes that are committed in the way we approach it. So, for example, some of the Nordic countries took the approach of not focusing on terrorism in addressing these conspiracies to commit crimes, and were more successful. Holland would be an example of that. In the United States, we have this war on terror, and we've invaded countries in contravention of international law, bringing chaos to the Middle East. So it's real important to be rigorous when you're applying legal analysis to crimes and political philosophy.
Thank you, sir. Well, we have a last question. We just got it on our WhatsApp account, and this is from Queen Aditi Agarwal. It says like Mahatma Gandhi's principle of truth and non-violence emphasizes the use of reform of heart rather than use of violence. In this context, could you please discuss the various Gandhian methods and their relevance in the modern times? I hope you have told a lot. If you could give a brief on this, please, sir.
Well, Gandhi used almost all of the traditional techniques for cleansing the heart that we find in all of the wisdom traditions of the world. Self-discipline and fasting, focusing on the qualities of love, bringing prayer into one's daily life, seeing the divinity and the affinity with all lives as a sacred duty and as the very enrichment of one's daily life. He traveled the distance from the head of the ideas of these ideals to the heart. And he knew one truth, that if you take one step toward God, he'll take 10 steps toward you. If you make it your intention to live by these higher ideals, circumstances will be arranged to fulfill those highest intentions. He lived by that principle, and he proved its effectiveness. Every single human being who's really committed to living a life based on the qualities of loving kindness and compassion has discovered that those qualities open up opportunities for their realization. So yes, of course, self-discipline and self-inquiry. What is the nature of my true self? Am I the sheaths that make up the sheaths of the body? Mahatma was a great student of the Bhagavad Gita. Mahatma took the different means of obtaining union with the divine very seriously. The teachings that are a part of the Sufi tradition are grounded in ahimsa. The teachings of the Jain tradition are grounded in ahimsa. The teachings of Jesus are grounded in ahimsa. So ahimsa doesn't just mean not hitting somebody. It means seeing what are the disturbances and disharmonies, the violence, the violations of the intrinsic harmony of the soul that we have within ourselves. They always come from false attachments to things, ideas that will disappear at some time. But the truth of being human, the luminosity of the soul of every person, that's immortal, that's eternal. And finding that within yourself is the most important thing. And if you find it in yourself, you'll see it in others. So we have to love humans and use things, never love things and use humans. Because the human is an expression of the divine. And if we realize that that part of every human being, which you can see in every infant that comes into this world, that part of every human being is where our connectivity is. And keeping that in mind, we have to make laws that protect it, institutions that nurture it, and political systems that are in harmony with it. These are the things that he taught, that he lived. These are the things that my teacher Baba Mahayuddin, a great Sufi master, and the Sufi master Khaja Moinuddin Chisti, and all the Sufi masters, and all of the great teachers of India, Ramana Maharshi, Ramakrishna, etc. They all lived by these same principles. They're not new. They're not owned by any people anywhere. They are universal because the blessing of life, the blessing of the planet Earth, the blessing of our living here together is universal and the commonwealth of all of us.
Oh, well, sir, we have a question from Kunal Agarwal. Kunal, sir, over to you, please.
I love Salman's picture. You see his face there, but behind him is the movement of the world. And it just says so much. He's here so peacefully, and you can see everything in the background moving. And that's kind of the way we have to be. We have to have a place within ourselves where we're centered and peaceful, and the world will continue moving in its chaotic way. But we have a right to have the kingdom of ourselves be a sanctuary of peace. That's the most important kingdom. That's the most important place to find peace first. Find it and nurture it within oneself. And then from there, we can build peace in our lives.
Correct, sir. Kunal, sir, over to you, please. Your mic is on mute. Kindly unmute it.
Good evening. I hope I'm audible. I'm sorry I'm outside. There might be some noises. Sir, I just have a simple question to you. Given that it's the election season and back in the U.S., so we also know that Trump contracted COVID, and that the first debate was really a mess because all of it, even Fox and CNN, both of them are saying that it didn't go down well. Both sides are claiming victory. So how do you feel that Gandhi's ideals could affect the current presidential elections? Because we are seeing a very major tectonic shift right now.
You know, Tiku, could you repeat what he said? He didn't come in clearly on
Okay. But sir, what exactly he said that the current elections that are likely to have in the US, and lately we just got to know that the US president is down with COVID along with his wife. How do you feel Gandhi's ideal could help in the 2020 elections, especially given the fact that the first debate was a mess?
The first debate was very revealing. Donald Trump was out of control. He couldn't control himself. He's a person without self-control, and he's completely self-centered, and his interests are purely personal. He's incompetent to run a state, because to run a state, you have to care about all the people. He only cares about the people that support him. That's not the way you can run a state. You can't run a modern state when you only care about your supporters. You have to care about all the people. And every state not only has to care about its own people, it has to care about the people of the planet. So he demonstrated his utter incompetence to be a president and the vileness of selfishness publicly. It was an embarrassment. Now, insofar as his having the virus, I pray that he recover and have his health and grow as a human being, but he's certainly not competent to be president. And I'm not even sure whether he has it because he lies perpetually and he's corrupted the very fabric of my country, the very values upon which it's founded, and the legitimacy of our political system. He's even put in question whether he would leave office if the election turns out adverse to his interests. We've never had any leadership in our country of such a vile nature, and it's very frightening. The only good news is it's a minority that supports him, and if the majority of people come out and vote, there'll be an overwhelming mandate to get rid of him and all of the people that have supported him and swallowed their own principles in the process. The Republican Party in my country created the Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Montreal Protocols to protect the ozone, used to believe in the rule of law, fiscal responsibility and governance. Many good things Republicans promoted. They didn't promote minimum wage and social justice very strongly, but they promoted a lot of good things. He's thrown them out. He has not run as a Republican. He's run as a public figure, as an entertainment figure, not worthy of a modern state. So it's a very, very serious, the most serious moment probably in the history of America since the Civil War. And the debate showed the lack of self-control that this gentleman has. The fact that he has the virus is ironic because he was calling it a hoax for so long, suggesting that you could treat it by drinking disinfectant. And his idea of controlling it is to have less people tested so it would look like it would only appear to be under control. I mean, we've had 200,000 people killed and the virus is still raging. And yet we know technically and medically how to contain, control, and eliminate it. And he's not applying it. So obviously my feelings are nonpartisan, but I feel that Donald Trump is a shame for my country. Let's be very clear. My opinions are not the opinions of the forum that have gathered us. These are purely my opinions. and he asked a question about the domestic politics in my country and the debate that just took place, and so I gave him my frank personal opinion.
So I would just like to get back if General KJ is there and he want to say something at the end. General KJ. Otherwise, we can just.
Tiku, when President Trump said that that Vice President Biden was against God, that really crossed the line for me. Mm-hmm. They use one of the 10 commandments is never to use God's name in vain, and what that means is not to use religion and the word of God to cause divisions amongst people. The principle of God is to bring unity and love. And when you demonize others, when you demonize them, then there's no longer room for reasoned discourse. And that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to demonize people in the political process. It's very important to have reasoned debate. Reasoned debate is the basis for a functioning democracy. And when you look at the history of fascism and the history of the violent takeovers of governments, it always begins when the political process is degraded into demonization rather than reasoned debate. And that's how serious this moment is and how deeply concerned I am. Possibly President Trump will return to the norms of political behavior. That would be great. But if he doesn't, we can't shy away from calling him out for this kind of conduct. The idea that he was legitimizing racist, violent organizations like the Proud Boys or the Nazis that showed up in Virginia during demonstrations is simply unacceptable to me. And I won't be silent about it under any circumstances, because such conduct will lead to bloodshed, and that's not acceptable. Nonviolence and listening and cooperation and respecting the opinions of others is the way forward. Demonizing others and not accepting that we can live together and listen carefully to one another we have to live together. We have to respect each other.
Exactly. So, sir, we have, thanks that you are giving a lot of time to our viewers, our researchers, our seniors, and answering almost all our questions. And well, we have a last question from Ms. Reddy. She says, if you could explain the individual and social aims of education according to Gandhiji.
Gandhiji's sense of education is the basis of what is the human journey for. I mean, it comes down to the purpose of why. And he saw the human journey as a journey for self-realization and the realization of the highest principles of the soul. And and what were the policies that are needed to do that? One, appreciation of diversity, of other points of view, and self-discipline, and the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion. Those are tools that can be part of an educational system. Yeah, we have to emphasize the importance of intellectual capacity. He was trained as a lawyer, and he used those skills, those analytic and insightful skills of reason and logic and reflective thought as tools for those higher values. And that certainly can be taught in the educational system. He also emphasized the importance of daily prayer. That can also be taught, but prayer certainly, as he said, he didn't care what method you used as long as it was directed toward the loving God. So those are things that can be infused in the educational system. By the way, I had the privilege of going to the Montessori school in Hyderabad. No, it was in Lucknow, one of the largest schools in India. And it was actually founded by a man whose namesake was Gandhi, Dr. Gandhi. And I was so impressed by their infusing these values in the students. And I think they have 50,000 students there. And I saw for myself a student body that was that had developed these in the tradition of Gandhi, where they had Muslim students learning the depths and dignity of Hinduism and vice versa, as well as religions and Christianity and Judaism, and learning all the religious traditions and appreciation for them. I saw that, and I saw the bright, inquisitive, open-minded, open-hearted student body there. So I saw a school in India that exemplified those principles of Gandhiji in practice. So I know it could be done. I was a vice principal of a high school at one time in my career, and I really enjoyed bringing these values into the students. And I saw that when students got those values, they were more interested in learning something that would be of use. They became more curious, more open, more enlivened. I think that viewing one's life as a journey as a student is a really good attitude. That each day is a learning experience, and we learn largely according to what we are looking for. If we're looking for negativity, you'll always find it. If you're looking for opportunities for unity and compassion and justice, they will appear for you.
Thank you, sir, for your deep insights on the life of Gandhi. It was indeed a great talk from both Haji Sayyid Salman Chishti ji and our dear friend and advisor of GCDC, and yes, Jonathan Granoff.
Let me apologize for any sense of American domestic partisanship being but I was asked the question, so I felt I had to answer candidly. But I want to thank you. For giving me the opportunity to talk about Gandhi's influence. Gandhi's influence cannot be measured, because you know, he is a cultural icon here in America. We all know of his impact on the civil rights movement, which is so predominant in our daily lives. And people in India should know that he was a figure of international significance, because he focused on the truth of the soul, which is the same everywhere.
Correct, as you rightly said, he was the truth of the soul. And once again, thank you. And GCTC feels very grateful to have you in this very august session.